Welcome, everyone. It is my great pleasure and honor to welcome two colleagues of the Hutchins Center, Marixa Lasso and Maya Doig-Acuña, as they present Marissa's book, Erased, the Untold Story of the Panama Canal. Dr. Lasso has served on the faculty of several universities in the US and Latin America, and currently she is director of the Center for the Study of History, Anthropology, and Culture, affiliated with Panama's Ministry of Culture. In 2016, she was a fellow at the Hutchins Center here at Harvard. She is the author of the influential books, Myths of Harmony, Race and Republicanism During the Age of Revolution, and Erased, the Untold Story of the Panama Canal, recently published by Harvard University Press. This book was received the Frederick Cutts Prize of the American Historical Association for the best book in Latin American and Caribbean history, as well as the William M. Leo Grande Award for the best book on U.S. Latin American relations. She is a member of the editorial board of the Hispanic American Historical Review, and a prolific scholar. She has contributed to such major journals in her field as the American Historical Review, Environmental History, and Citizenship Studies. She has received numerous grants, including from the American Council of Learned Societies, the National Humanities Center, the Social Science Research Council, the Fulbright Commission, and the Wenner-Gren Foundation. Dr. Lasso will be joined in discussion by Maya Doig-Acuña. Maya is a writer and a PhD candidate in African American Studies at Harvard. Her research interests include Black diaspora formation, family history, and migration in the circum-Caribbean world. Her dissertation draws on Black feminist methods to examine Afro-Caribbean commemorative practices and everyday placemaking in 20th century Panama and New York City, with particular focus on the intimate dimensions of Black women's lives across imperial geographies. Among her many prize-winning essays, her The Most Caribbean of Stories was selected as one of Southern Culture's Journal's top 20 of 2021. So welcome to you both, and we will begin with Marissa's reading of Erased, and this will be followed by conversation between Marissa and Maya, and then we will invite the audience to comment or ask questions. Would you like to start, Marissa?
Yes, hello everybody. Thank you so much for this kind invitation. Hello everybody. And I would like to take a moment to express my gratitude to the Hutchins Centers. I finished writing this book here, and the dialogue with my fellows at the time was really, really important for the shape it finally took. So I'm very grateful for that. I particularly remember some talks and conversations about the epilogue, which ended up being my favorite part of the book, but I would not have dared to write it the way I did if it were not for some conversations I had at the Hutchins. So thank you. I'll start reading not from the book, but something about what I felt writing it, and a brief summary for those who haven't read it. What does it mean for a historian to grow up in the tropics? It means growing up with an idea of world history that tells you that history is made by others. The world that surrounds you was somebody else's idea. It belongs to somebody else's culture. It is to grow up in a place that people call a banana republic. Why? Because of the weight of stories we have been hearing about the tropics. So this talk and my book about the Panama Canal, it can be read as a manifesto about the very idea of banana republic. Let's look at this example of the Panama Canal to see how the erasure of tropical history became entrenched in our global culture. Digging had just started when writers and journalists began to write the first Panama Canal stories. They were truthfully stories. They told me about this. This is the Panama Canal zone for those, the old Panama Canal zone for those who don't know the geography, so you can say this. When writers and journalists began to write about the Panama Canal. There were triumphal stories that detailed the feat of US doctor who defeated yellow fever, US engineers who conquered tropical nature, the public really fascination how the doctors discovered the habits of yellow fever mosquitoes, and US engineers built the canal's gigantic locks. Everything about the canal was huge, impressive. The Panama Canal history was a saga of modern engineers. It was, for the 20th century, what Egyptian pyramids had been for the ancient world. US writer presented the construction of the canal as solely a US story. The canal might be located in Panama, but Panamanians had little to do with the canal or its history. The story of Panama Canal was somebody else's history. It was the history of US technology, of US urbanism, of US medicine. This location in Panama was a mere accident. It could have been built in another place like Nicaragua. This is why the history of the Panama Canal has been mostly written by US historians. It seems a topic unrelated to the history of Latin America. Those who lived in the region before and after the canal construction seem peripheral to the history. They do not matter. But is that correct? The Panama Canal is a good place for thinking about a history of the world in which people from the tropics are active protagonists in the creation of the world in which we live. The Panama Canal symbolizes many ideas about world history in which political, economic, and technological changes that we associate with the 19th century, constitutional governments, capitalist economy, and the social revolution were all produced in Europe and the US. The rest of the world, like Panama, merely suffered, adapted, resisted, or copied, but never created. In these dichotomies, Panama is the tropics, a place where modern technology arrives as an exotic bird to a nature that lives in another time, a tropical time. And this is part of what my book wants to challenge and part of the history that I'm going to tell. No? So what is this history? This history and this image, I love this image of Teddy Roosevelt on top of the great machinery and the great locks of the Panama Canal. It's the history of a US bringing modernity to the jungle. What was there in the Panama Canal, according to these histories and these ideas, was only jungle. And this map of 1912 presents this very clearly. You know, there is the canal, the gigantic Lake Gatun, the greatest artificial lake at the time, in the middle of this green space. You know, if you look at this map, there's nothing, no towns, nothing, no people. But what is, and this is not another great picture of this technological history, but what was the real history? Now, what was there? What is that we erased when we told that story? This is before the canal, there was a river, the Chagres River, which was where people traded goods for centuries before the canal. And as you can see, each name there is a little town. And it's a historic town that tells you that this area, far from being the jungle, was the most densely populated part of Panama, where trade and traffic and technology had existed since the 16th century, connecting global goods since that time. You know, so it's a heavily, very important part of Panamanian history, not the jungle. This is an area by the US Census of 1912 that had 41 towns, 61,000 people in a country that had around 350,000 people. So this area, far from being the jungle, was the most densely populated part of the country, the sort of the vertebral column of Panama. You know, its most important municipalities were there. Its most important trade routes, most important towns were in that area. So one of the first problems, and one of the things I discovered doing the research for the book, is that when the US took with the 1904 treaty, the Panama Canal, it did not have a clear idea what to do with Panama's historic towns and its inhabitants. And the idea was at first, well, just to govern them. There was no message, no idea, no plan to depopulate the canal zone and to erase all the Panamanian towns and historic towns that were there. And I want to show 3 examples. I don't want to take much time because I want to allow time for conversation, but to give you an idea, because often people tell me when I tell this story, well, this had happened in other places where dams have been built. And the story I'm telling is one in no. This depopulation did not happen because of the Panama Canal construction. It was not necessary for the construction of the Panama Canal. It happened for the construction of the Panama Canal zone, the area around the canal. Not only that, but rarely something of this magnitude happens in the most important part of a country, in the center of a country. And this is what I really would like to emphasize. This is what's happening here. So I want to tell the story of the first town to be depopulated, Gatun, where the Gatun locks were going to be built. You can see in the background of this image, the houses of Gatun town. And here a close-up with the houses, a few of the houses there. And the first decision, it was the first town to be depopulated in 1908, was not to expel its inhabitants from the Panama Canal zone. That was not the idea. They were moved nearby inside the canal zone, and another permanent Gatun town was built that was supposed to last forever. No? The idea in 1908 of depopulating the zone was not in anybody's mind. So you can see here the same technological need to use a land occupied by a town for the canal was solved by moving people nearby. Inside the canal zone, the population was not needed. And here we can see the church of that historic town, close-up of the church. And then we have a second example, the municipality of Gorgona. This town was flooded barely a few streets. So it could have moved nearby, just like Lake Gatun, not even move the entire town. But what happened here, by 1912, something had changed between 1908 and 1912. By 1911, the US and the Isthmian Canal Commission began to debate a very important debate that had enormous consequences for Panama. What to do with the people? Will the zone be populated or depopulated? A Congress commission came to Panama, asked the question to the most important high officers. People had different opinions. Some wanted the zone to be depopulated, others wanted people in the zone. And what is important is when you read this debate, there is nothing about technology in there. It's all about what kind of people they wanted in the zone. It was all about race. It was about racism. And after that debate, it was decided to depopulate the zone, eliminate all the towns that were there, and create new towns in other areas. So Taft in 1912 had an executive decree depopulating the Panama Canal zone. So this second town, the depopulation happened after that. And people were asked to leave their town and to move outside of the canal zone. And here started a process of taking towns apart, taking the houses apart, taking people on train by train, 500 people at a time, until all the towns were, in a few years, eliminated. Now here is you can see an image of this town that doesn't exist anymore, an old colonial town that grew up in the 19th century because of the California gold rush. And then during the French Canal grew more as a centerpiece for Panama Canal construction, and even more during the US Canal construction. And then the people from Old Gatun, the ones who had moved in 1908 to a permanent town, were told, you have to move again. you have to move again because we don't want you in the canal zone. We want to depopulate. And then I found this sort of very heartbroken 2-letter of people telling, the undersigned used to be peoples of Olgatun, where we were born, until we were forced to move to New Gaton, where we were given new residence. And they told us that we will not be disturbed again, that we will live here. And then we started our agricultural endeavors, etc. And then they are saying, we, the people of New Gatun, have been the most tormented by canal necessity. And finally, we have the depopulation of Chagres, which was outside of the original canal zone limits. And again, because the mouth of the Chagres River is a very important strategic location, militarily, and also the entrance of the water to the Panama Canal in some ways, it was decided that it was an area too strategic, too important to have a Panamanian town there. And through negotiations that I explored and talk about in the book, this town was asked to leave. Now, the question that I ask, and I'm going to go very briefly over them, is what ideas make depopulation possible in a place like Panama? Why is it possible to depopulate an area that is a process that is time-consuming, expensive, really hard on people, that is not even necessary for the canal construction? What ideas makes this possible? And is what I started talking about before is certain ideas about the tropics. And I put these 2 images because one is an image of a drawing that again and again, native hut in Matachin. And if you see this image, you see it looks like these people, the Panamanians who live around the canal, are isolated in the middle of nowhere with no connection to the Panama Canal. They're not connected to this history. You would not have known if you see this image that the people living there were the muleteers, the boatmen, the people that build the roads, build the railroad, build the canal, and the people who had traded in the area for centuries. No connection is there with the history of the trade route, which the Panama Canal is the latest version. And if you see the other image, you can see the huts also in the background. We're in the middle of everything. You see the construction, the steam, the power, all the industrial power there mixed with the huts. There is no an isolated native hut and then the technology on the other side. They're part of the same history. But the depopulation was possible because these histories were separated. Technology belonged to one people and some sort of native primitiveness to the other. Also, depopulation was possible because the history of these towns as municipalities with a long Republican tradition of citizenship, of voting rights, as one of the places in the world when Panama was part of Colombia that had, before the US abolition of slavery, universal citizenship rights for men, where you have Black mayors, Black citizens voting. Since the 19th century, these municipalities were transformed in little jungle towns with no history, no permanence, to rhetoric. So once you have these disconnections of the canal and from this root of these people, of these towns, from its politics, from its history, it was easier to depopulate. So if you kept telling again and again that it was just a jungle landscape with a few people there with no historical connection to these areas, with no civilization, with no politics, with no municipalities that were with long histories, some of them like Chagres, that went back to the 16th century as these towns, then there was nothing to miss. There was nothing was lucid. There was no history. There was no connection to the land. So that's why recovering these histories is very important, because it means recovering the connection of Panama to its historic route, to its canal. And as we connect the history of Panama to its own technology, to its own histories, connecting also the history of many other places of the third world to their technology, to their place where they live. And the flooding of the Lake Gatun, which became in book after book, history after history, the reason why these towns were eliminated became a way of erasing two histories: the history of the resistance to depopulate that had nothing to do with the canal, and then the erasure of the towns themselves, and with the towns, Panama's connection to the canal, to the route, and to that history. And this is a beautiful image of the town of Chagres, not of its church. So that's why recovering this history is important, I think, because it connects Panama and Panamanians to the long history of the route and therefore of the canal. Thank you.
Thank you. Maya, would you like to comment and ask questions?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much, Dr. Lasso, for sharing a little bit more about your book, but even more for writing that book, because I think it just offers such a vital intervention, not only in historiography and kind of like scholarly discussions about the Panama Canal, but also in broader imaginaries of what was there first, of the history of that space. I think there's like a way I thought as I was reading it about why when I was younger, it never occurred to me to even kind of wonder what was in the canal zone first. You know, my father's Panamanian and I studied Panama. And so I think that there's a way your book shows how erasure, when it's really effective, principally what it does is also reroutes people away from asking certain kinds of questions. So thank you for making those interventions. I think it's also offering this really rich spatial history that shows how silencing and erasure are in fact embedded into like material landscapes. And you offer that with so much texture. So gracias. I wanted to actually begin. I'm eager to ask questions in particular about some of those mechanisms of erasure and about the historic towns in the zone, but I actually want to start with your introduction, because I think you begin that with some personal reflection, right, on growing up in Panama and, you know, being a little girl and kind of having this intimate proximity to the zone while also being excluded from it because you were Panamanian, right, and having that just be sort of like the story of so many Panamanians living in Panama City or Colón and in proximity to the zone. And I'm wondering kind of this method of like starting with your own memory is a little bit different, right, from Myths of Harmony, a little bit different from a lot of academic writing, although I think that's shifting. And so I'm just wondering if, you know, why did you choose to begin the book there? And did you feel like maybe this book required something different from you than other scholarly projects?
Yes, I felt this book required something different from me. First, it was a very intimate book. It was my history in ways that were not the same before. And also, I thought this was a book that I wanted people who were not academics to read. I wanted this book to be accessible to my family, to my friends, to people in Panama, and also, of course, in the US. So, and I wanted also to elicit empathy, because I think, and this is a belief I have, that if we somehow want to use scholarship and history to create a better world, to tell other history, we need to create empathy. And there's nothing that creates more empathy than putting yourself in the history, particularly if it's your history, you know. Mm-hmm. So that's why I started. Also, it was my second book, and there's a beauty in academia about the second book is you have more freedom. You are more free to experiment with writing and with styles. So that I took advantage of that freedom to really push myself to write a book as accessible as possible, but based on research, not solid academic and scholarly research. So that's why I put myself there. also, I have to say, I was inspired because nobody is really that original by a book about Chicago by Cronin. And he starts, I remember reading his book, and he starts, he's driving in his car, but Chicago and the smoke and four factories. And I'm like, wow, this is beautiful. I love this. And then but I have the same memories about the canal. No, I was driving through, and the power that the way he wrote it had on me. I wanted to transform and use that to put myself in the canal. And therefore, everybody of my generation or previous generation who drove in a car in Panama knew exactly what I was talking about. No, and we were all told not to throw anything out the windows. So no, and we were all kind of had this fear of the area, of anything could happen to us. So that's
yeah, that makes so much sense. And I think, and there is a level of accessibility. We were talking beforehand about how it's a beautifully written book and meticulously researched, but also there is this sense of like narrative closeness in it that I think I imagine reaches out to a lot of audiences. And yeah, answers so many questions that I think a lot of Panamanians will either know because of historical memory, which you kind of get at it in the epilogue as well, but also questions that we might not also think to ask. And I did notice it sounded like this book, with the freedom, of the second one, allowed you a little bit more space to experiment with other methods and to do something that was also strategic rhetorically in terms of like resisting some of that erasure of these historical towns and how we talk about the canal zone more broadly. On that note, I wanted to also ask, I think reading this book, I was so struck by your own critical approaches to the archive, and in particular to your reading strategies of, like, for instance, correspondence among canal authorities, how they wrote about these communities, how they negated modernity. And so there's a way it feels so instructive, like, here's how to recognize state strategies of, erasure or imperial myth making. And I think coming from the US right now, I think those strategies that feels especially useful to identify at a moment when, at least, here, so many state governments are engaging in this intentional and violent erasure of particular histories, of state oppression, of political counter-struggle, where those histories would otherwise provide evidence of continuity and survival, among Black and Indigenous and queer and trans communities. So I wonder, I have a sense of this, but why is it so important to you not only to reconstruct what's been obscured in historical narrative, but also the mechanisms through which that can happen, kind of more broadly? And I guess, what are the stakes of that? And having written this book, what might you tell people to look out for, if someone asked, as far as recognizing that kind of erasure while it's happening?
Yes, one of the sad things about the kind of prejudice, geographical prejudices, not just racial, but also geographical prejudices, is that the people living in these places in my country, myself included, we grew up believing this thing as somehow truth. So in order to get that out of our system, we need to understand how those truths were built. That's why you have to explain the language that was used and how that was used. No, I used to teach engineers when I was a professor in Colombia, in Bogota. And I was saying, what does it mean to be an engineer in Latin America if you're told that all the history of technology comes from somewhere else and your region had nothing to do? What does it mean to believe in elections and citizenship in a place where they tell you that those ideas are not yours, when we're created by somebody else and you are just imitating, and badly so? When really your region was one of the pioneers in the world to do that, no? And as other people had not just me, many others have also studied recently. So it's really important to understand how that happened. Otherwise, we don't quite believe it ourselves. No? And so that's part of the reason why that was so important to me. But it was also important to me to recover the voices of dissent too, within those US officers, those of the Isthmian Canal Commission. That was also important to remember that it was not unanimous. There were people who opposed that. No, because also it was the truth, that's what happened. Not everybody agreed, first. And second, it's also more hopeful, frankly, to remember that not everybody agreed on that. So so that was very important to me to remember that, that Gorgas, for example, said, call me romantic, but I prefer a populated canal zone. And within the language of the time was one of the people who defended most. And that some of US mayors, with all the racial structure and racism of the time, defended Panamanian citizens of their town. And that's why they eliminated the municipalities with US mayors. So it's important to remember the complexity, I think, always.
Yes, that makes sense. I think that struck me too, like Gorgas kind of just at every turn sort of being like, no, I think actually we should have people here. And actually, no, we should include screens for everyone's homes because everyone should be protected from malaria. And then kind of like seeing how even somebody as influential and significant as him can kind of get, not defeated. That seems, harsh, but like ignored or dismissed. But I agree that the more complex history of kind of dissent is really important and is equally instructive. That makes a lot of sense. And I hear you too, that the big questions about the stakes of this are also just how does, having your own history negated reshape your sense of self and collective self. And so that's part of the stakes here is revising, right, revaluing our histories. And one of my questions too along those lines are you seeing shifts now, or what are the shifts that you're seeing in Panama in, for instance, how the government or cultural institutions are narrating Panama Canal history? I think about, for instance, there's a lot happening at the Museo del Canal right now as far as reinterpretation around Caribbean labor migration, and I think also around the treaty, the Torrijos-Carter Treaty. And so, I'm just wondering, I guess another way to phrase it is, where do you see communities in Panama resisting cultural and historiographic erasure around these themes?
Well, first, I've been very happy with the way the book has been received and the comments people, things people tell me, how they have felt empowered just by reading a different version of their own history. And that's a recurrent comment I hear from people who have read it first in English and then in Spanish. And then I was also very happy to see it in the Panama Canal Museum, how this history now is in a museum, which is telling also now this history. So that was, that's what, we do the research, and then the museums sort of, take it and go to other places with that. But it's still recent, the book came out in 2019, and then in Spanish in 2021. So we'll see, it takes much longer to get to this kind of shifts in narrative to get to high schools and schools. But that's my hope.
Yes. Yeah, no, I mean, I think actually I have this memory of when this was published, a couple of WhatsApp, as we mentioned, is the real space where people are having conversations online. And a couple of my cousins send me links and being like, have you seen this? Do you know this book? Like, did you know that this happened? So it is absolutely making that type of impact. And I'm eager to see how else that'll change popular interpretation. But yeah, I'm also excited about, there's this current census undertaking in Panama and the push to document, Afro-descendant populations. And it does seem like there's a lot of movement around shifting our, broader understanding of of history there. I also am, we only have a couple of minutes left before we slip into broader Q&A. I just want to ask a couple of more questions. One is actually a little bit more about the Panamanian Republic and the state and its role in, you talk a little bit in the book, or a lot, about how discourses of scientific racism, right, were shaping US imperial imaginaries of Latin America, were part of what allowed the US to negate modernity as practiced in Panama. Can you talk a little bit, though, too, about how some of those discourses circulated within Latin America and kind of functioned there? I'm thinking, for instance, of, Keisha Coronaldi's new book, Panama in Black, and kind of how it shows anti-Blackness in Panama, for instance, not being kind of just an outgrowth of US imperial influence, but having its own manifestation in Panama separately from that, and some, you do talk about that a bit in your book, but I'm just wondering if you can speak on a little bit how those discourses also shaped what was happening within the Republic of Panama simultaneously as we have kind of all of this racism reshaping the Canal Zone.
Yes, but we need to understand a little bit that everybody in Latin America and the US in the 19th century were having debates about the relationship between race and citizenship, But I think the crucial part of what was happening in Panama and in Colombia is that the Liberal Party, and there was no separate Black Liberal Party. It was called the entire Liberal Party Black because of so many of its members were Black in Panama, and they achieved real positions of power. To say that didn't happen is the equivalent of negating the gains after the civil rights movement. So the 19th century was an era of gaining rights for the Afro-Panamanian population. And it's important to remember that, not to erase that history too. So when the US comes, you have a Liberal Party who had lost first its power with the regeneration in the 1880s, and which is the late 19th century in the US with post-Reconstruction and the rest of Latin America. It's a moment of conservative going back to power and the end of those rights. But you still have that Liberal Party fighting against that and fighting for more elections. And you have this enormous participation of Afro-Panamanian in that history and in that. And so much so you have somebody like Carlos A. Mendoza who becomes president,
Right.
100 years before Obama. And then the US says, no, you cannot have this person as a president. So to say that they're the same at the time will not be true. No, we can say that the people who thought like that in the US that existed too were not in power. And in Panama were sometimes in power and sometimes not. And it's important to remember sort of those struggles and those transitions. I think it's crucial. And to remember that it's always a debate and that sometimes and a struggle. And sometimes the people who support more racist measures are in power and sometimes are not. And I think that's what I try to emphasize is in the mid-19th century was a real moment of experimentation in democratic politics in places like Panama, with a majority Black population that were having real positions of power. Not they were real, not. So it's important to remember that also to fight, because if we say that never happened, then we keep reinforcing these ideas that democracy is something that people have never experienced, had never fought for, had never upheld. And we have a long history of doing so. A long history that is as old as that of, it's older, you could argue even that of places like France. So it's important to remember that and not dismiss that as, it's funny because in some ways, in the history of Latin America, we have collectively in the 20th century, we raised how much people from popular groups pushed for more inclusion, for more democratic participation, and sometimes winning and then losing, no? But it's important to remember that.
Yes, yes, absolutely. Gracias. Thank you. I think we're just about at time for broader Q&A. I did just, if I have a second, it's a quick question, but I'm just so curious about it because I was just really struck by your extraordinary archival work in this book, and to really reconstruct the community life and the political life in these towns that don't exist anymore. And so I'm just curious if you've used any digital technology during the writing process to kind of support that, or since publication, if there have been kind of any digital technologies used to visualize some of those reconstructions.
Well, for the research, it was old school archival research because it's the only one to recover those kind of history. Because something, and I'm going to say this, usually when archives digitize documents, they start with the ones everybody knows. So because I was going into a history that has not been told, nobody had thought of digitizing those documents. So I had to be really old school archival research, of hunting and having hints and oh, okay, following clues until I could recreate through thousands of documents this description. Very old school historical work. That is, I think, sometimes the only one possible to recreate these histories. I'm in the process, I'm talking with some people about now representing them digitally for recreation digitally. So, but we're talking, we'll see what happens. I'll keep you posted.
Thank you. I'm excited to learn.
Thank you. We invite people from the audience to comment or ask questions. Sheila Walker.
Yeah, when I think of Panama, I think of all of the African place names all over the country, Mandinga, El Congo, Cambo, Malambo. And I wonder, thinking about Erasure, my colleague, Toshi Sakai, who is also on this call, and I have gone to many of those places and asked people there why these places have African names, who are the Congos, who are the Carabalis, and the answers are monkeys, wasps. And I'm curious, and we've also asked people who we thought might know, who didn't necessarily live in those places, why there were all of these African names. Panama has the concentration of African names in the Americas, place names. So do you have any comment about that? I mean, that seems like a huge erasure. We didn't find anybody who could discuss the African names with us.
I think this is part of a really important erasure of many things Panamanian history. I think part of the sadness of places like Panama, of being told again and again that your history is not rich, that you have no history, is that we don't support the historical research necessary to not erase those names, to have multiple scholars looking at these things. We don't have them. And that's part of, it's a generic problem of, I talked about one type of erasure, but if we go, there are many others also about indigenous people history in Panama. So you're absolutely right. And I personally think it's part of this generic sense that of non-acknowledgement, the richness and complexity of our history.
Thank you.
Thank you. Jose Medina.
Dr. Lasso, very good to see you again. My question is the connection between the depopulation of the towns that existed around the canal to the creation of the Black towns that existed during the canal zone, cities like Paraíso, that I remember living in the canal zone. Is there a connection between the two?
Yes, thank you, Jose. Good to see you here. Yes, we part of the traditional Panamanian history is that right away we had a gold roll and silver roll towns, but there is a prehistory to that, no? And the prehistory to that is before depopulation, where we still have Panamanian municipalities. There was a division, a segregation between native towns and native quarters and Isthmian Canal Commission quarters. No, that this was the first segregation. And according to ideas of scientific racism of the time, and they were popular in Africa, Asia, and then Panama, there was a distance for keeping healthy the white population. No? So that started then, before the population, in this segregation between native and non-native towns. After the population, then, of course, the workforce was mostly of African descent. And some people were allowed to live inside the canal zone in these segregated towns. But what differentiated that from before is this idea of perfection, of a segregated perfection, if you want to call it, that was to be exemplary of an ordered towns, no? And then you have these new towns that were segregated, black and white. And although officially they were U.S. and not U.S., no, that was the official justification, because after all it was the U.S. federal government, and that Julie Green explains it really well. So you have that history and then that post-history, but what happening with those towns that makes it different from Panama is after depopulation, the canal zone became like something no real urban space ever has, which is no poverty, no unemployment, all the houses clean, no city, not even Paris, New York, no city is perfect. No city is like that. But if you kick everybody out and just leave a few people, it's possible to have that kind of urban, I won't call it perfection because it's not, but that kind of model appearance that the ICC aspired to show.
Thank
So
you.
there really wasn't any overlap between people who went from one place to another.
Very few. Some, of course, because you have a small permanent, but it were in different locations. The original towns were mostly to the west of the canal, and then the new towns were to the east, and they're not the same locations.
Thank you, Dr. Lasso.
Thank you. There's a question in the chat from Jamie Martin, who asks, you mentioned the erasure was due to race, but wasn't it against all Panamanians of all races? And could it be they wanted to make the area a US territory?
Well, I am not speculating here. I am reading the debates. And all Panamanians were considered racially inferior, no, regardless of skin tone, but let's put it that way. And also, we Panamanians need to remember that we have always been mostly a population that is dark skinned, the majority of the population. But everybody was native, no? And I remember when I first reading, who are these native? Because I usually think of it as Native Americans, but then I realized, no, native is where everybody they were talking about. So in the debates themselves, when they start talking, they said, it's in the documents, no? They say, we don't want these Black people living in the canal zone. They are disorderly, they take too much, they are not clean, they are not good, I mean, they're inferior, and it's easier to sanitize if we put them both in Panama City and Colón. So that's the language used. That's the language that wins the argument. That's what they say in the documents, in the debates. So I'm not putting words in their mouth. Is the era, is the time. People thought that way. And it's important to remember that people thought that way and the consequence of thinking that we had. If anything, to be aware of that and not do things like that again, no?
While other people think about their questions, I have a quick one. Can you tell us a little bit about any resistances on the part of Panamanians to moving from west to east, and whether they found other locations?
Yes, there was no resistance in the sense of huge riots. At least I did not find it in the archives. At least I didn't find it. What you have, it's lots of complaints to Panamanian government and the EICC, sort of written letters of saying, this is not fair, and asking the Panamanian governments to negotiate. And then you have the Panamanian governments in the cases have found something, saying, and this was in the case of Chavez, they go a commission go to the press, to the Ministry of Foreign Relations, and then his answer, a member of Panamanian elite said, well, we had to disarm the police. We didn't want to, but we had to. So the best we could do is get some money out of it. You have no choice, not because it's right. I mean, he never said there were, he was really clear about the difference in power relations. It's going to happen. We cannot stop it. And the best we can do is negotiate so you get compensation. And that's the sense you get, is some sense of complaints and powerlessness. No, that's what I see in the letters of denunciation from towns. No.
Thank you. Maya, do you have any other comments or questions?
I see a question from in the comments.
Oh, you do? Okay.
How the ICC informed by this? Yeah.
How did the ICC, informed by the signs of the time, also justify the exclusion of the numerous non-native workers recruited from Spain and Italy from the canal zone's towns?
Well, because the debate was whether the ICC wanted a populated or depopulated. So it wasn't that specific. It said, do we want a populated or depopulated? When it was decided they wanted a depopulated canal zone, all towns were gone, regardless of who lived there, workers. It was not just workers, but also people who had lived there for centuries, store owners, bank owners. And there were all kinds of things there at the time, no? These were complex towns, just like small colon cities and Panama, in the middle of the Isthmian. So once the decision was made, let's depopulate, it was everybody. No, it was not that careful. Everybody has to go. There were announcements made to the people of Gorgona and Parador, you have to go. This town is going to end, is going to disappear. And then there were sort of compensations. Well, it's a long process that I explained, but that's, so it was not differentiated that way. The debate was very generic.
Thank you. There's another one from Jose de Gracia. He says, hello. Leaving aside the ICC's thoughts on race and the zone, do you think racism in Panamanian society at the time played any role in the depopulation of the towns where, for example, many West Indians used to live?
Panamanians' idea played no role in this. This was a US government decision. And actually everybody suffered from this decision because the people living in these towns, these were historic towns that went back to, some of them to the 16th century, to the 19th century, to the 18th century. So let's have this clear. And if I say there's a small version of Panama City and Colón, it also means that all kind of Panamanians live there, just like all kind of Panamanians live in the city. So everybody suffered. Everybody lost their lands, everybody lost their homes. And in that sense, no, nobody in the Panamanian government wanted that to happen. No Panamanian wanted that to happen because it was not beneficial to anybody.
Thank you. Maya, did you want to speak?
Sure. Yes. If there's a moment, I'm happy to ask a couple questions. One is, this book is, of course, like a deep critique of US empire and also the ideas of Western dominance as being kind of constitutive of modernity. And you're also interested, Dr. Lasso, I think, in recovering Panama's claims to modernity. And I wonder if in the historic towns, the democratic traditions that were centuries old or with 19th century old, being practiced there, do you see that as also, possible alternate models to the to like 20th century Western understandings of what it meant to be, modern, what it meant to be kind of democratic, or is it more sort of about documenting how racism among the US authorities allowed them to dismiss something right in front of them? Does that make sense?
Yes, it makes sense. I think one of the things that is really important for me to recover is, and I'm not original in that, is that everything we call the Western is really global. I mean, the changes of the 19th and 20th century are global changes that belong to everybody. And to recover everybody's contribution to those changes is really important, to own the world in which we live. I mean, because we live in this global world, we like it or not, this is our world. And it was created in the 19th century. That's when technology, railroads were everywhere, no? Not just in one place. That's where democratic institutional governments became popular everywhere. And you have constitutionalists in China and in the Middle East. So it's important to recover that this was a creation and it didn't go from one place to the other, because then you have these hierarchies. We create first and then you copy. That's not what happened. And it's important to destabilize those hierarchies and to remember that they were created at the same time. And in the Americas, with all its complexities, Black Americas, Indigenous Americas, were some of the first places that they created these ideas and experimented with them and lived with them. So to transform to what was a huge erasure was to transform was something of the Americas. No, and in 19th century Europe, nobody was voting and having elections at the same time that people were doing it in Mexico and Argentina and Colombia. So it's important to remember, it's sort of, if we don't remember everybody's contribution to history, then somehow the people who don't contribute seem to have less ownership rhetorically and culturally, in the way we think about it, to the world in which we live, So that's what I think is very important. And I would like to add, and in a different question, is that in my previous answer, I'm not one to say that there were no racism in Panama, because that would be ridiculous. That's not what I'm saying. But that decision was a specific decision made by the U.S. federal government. That Panamanian had nothing to win from that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Isabella Chavasco from the audience has a question or comment.
Hi, Dr. Marixa. I really want to thank you for your book. I was born in Panama right after the Americans left, so there's a lot that I'm still kind of trying to understand about why I live in a country that is so weird in a way. It's the word that I would use. So about that, I feel like Panama has a very wounded and fragile kind of self-esteem and sense of identity that I guess is typical of a banana republic. This passiveness and acceptance and kind of tolerance of injustice that I feel like is still seen today. How is this related? What is going on today in politics and in social, I'm not gonna go so deep into that, but how is that related to being a banana republic, and how do you think we can continue to step away or to grow from that?
I do think what you say first, that we are a wounded place, is absolutely true. I mean, it's and from previous time, I mean, just the history of Panama City, being completely burned to the ground in the 17th century and have to start again, and being, I don't know how many times Panama City have been bombed, and Portobello, just being a strategic place creates certain kind of wounds. And the problem with wounds that are not acknowledged is that I think they cannot heal properly, perhaps, and we cannot talk about what's the best way to deal with that legacy or that. And the fact that, as I mentioned at the beginning, I don't think we're a banana republic. I don't think banana republics exist. The notion of banana republics is part of the damage of the wound. Know that places that are as real and as complex as anybody and were crucial, like Panama, in the first experiment of republicanism in the 19th century with early elections. I mean, if one of the was a different research project, but in 1812, you already have Afro-Panamanians voting in the Cadiz Constitution, no? So to erase that democratic participation and that complex participation and transform anything that is republicanism and citizenship into fake banana-like, not real, it makes the wound worse and it disempowers people. Because if what they do is not real, why even bother? You know, they have no rights. They're mimicking, and that really disempowers rights. And I think that's what's so powerful and not powerful in history. People who have countries and communities who have powerful histories about themselves behave differently from those who have been told again and again that they have done nothing, you know?
Thank you. And whereas we would like to go on forever, I think we must conclude. So thank you so much, Marixa. Thank you so much, Maya. And thank you everyone in the audience who joined us. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.